Chapter 31, The Occupation of Ophelis Hall 1. My original goal was to create a safe living environment for myself before vacation ended. My crude wooden shelter was now dirty and deteriorating. I couldn't even remember the last time I had a good night's sleep. I thought I would be able to finish my cabin before our school break ended so I could start living in it once the second semester rolled in. But now that the second semester was just a week away, I realized I still had a long way to go. I looked at my cabin. It now had a wooden door and a window. I made sure to buy a big hinge this time. It would be a headache if it fell off again. Although I was worried it would quickly get rusty due to its size, and soon make that loud creaky sound. Well, it was still better than just falling off. Anyway, I still had more work left to do before I could live in my cabin. The most important things right now were a fireplace and some furniture. I was actually worried about the fireplace. Sure, it wasn't that cold this time of the year, even at night, but once the season changes, indoor heating would become a must. On top of that, a fireplace would provide my only source of light at night. It was also necessary to cook my food. Fire was needed for many other survival purposes. It was absolutely essential that I be able to start a fire indoors. But it would be a disaster if I make a fireplace out of wood and it catches on fire. It would be a disaster. This was the reason I needed to build my fireplace with a stronger material. The first thing that came to mind was bricks. Elk Company's general store downtown sold everything you could think of, but it would still be too much, even for them, to be selling bricks in an educational facility. I ended up going to Nail Hall's construction site and asked to buy some of their bricks, but they couldn't sell me any since their bricks were delivered exactly as inventoried. In the end, I decided to start making my own bricks. Newly crafted product. Brick casting. Construction scraps were nailed together to make a square. You can mold mud into bricks by filling it with mud. Production difficulty level, 0.5. Phew. It only took me 5 minutes to make a mold to cast my bricks in. I threw my hammer on my workbench and wiped off my sweat. I gathered mud from the river and squeezed it into the casting, making sure to press it in hard. I then took it under the shade and removed the cast. I planned to mass-produce standardized bricks by repeating this process tens, or even hundreds, of times. I would then dry them for a week and then stack them up in my cabin to create a decent fireplace and chimney. However, I would be using mud to stick my bricks together instead of cement. This worried me since mud wasn't as strong and adhesive as cement was. I thought I should make and attach a support fixture to keep everything together. It would also be great if I could make some furniture to use indoors, but I didn't have any specific plan for that just yet. I could easily make some simple pieces of furniture since my woodworking proficiency was quite high. I had learned quite a few tricks here and there. The design behind each was actually quite easy to come up with. Items like tables and chairs were relatively simple as long as I had the materials. It should also be quite easy to create a bed frame. Although for the mattress, it should work if I were to buy something like a large piece of fabric or bag of sorts and fill it up with feathers, cotton, or hay. I would also like to install a glass window, if possible. But I wondered where I would even be able to purchase such a thing. I walked through the forest as I gathered my thoughts, my bow in hand as I searched for my meal for the day. Combat skills details. Grade, beginner combatant. Specialized fields, bow. Bow proficiency level 6. Vital points snipe level 3. Quick shot level 2. Retreat shot level 1. Sense of aim level 2. Field of view expansion level 1. It was at times like this that I realized just how talentless Ed Roth's Taylor was in combat skills. I always had to force myself to use the bow whenever I went out to hunt. But the vacation was almost over and my bow skills were still this poor. Looked like I would need some special measures to grow this as well. I would find a way, one way or another. I found one. I chanced upon a fawn walking through the forest. I hid among the trees and took out my bow. I had been finding all sorts of people at my camp recently. Belle Maya used to stop by and share various ingredients with me, but she hadn't been coming over as much these days. Meanwhile, Ziggs would jog through the forest once every 3 or 4 days. Apparently, he hadn't only been running through the forest, but all over Akan Island instead. Just as I expected, his vitality stat wasn't normal. If not for Elka being in the magic department, I was sure he would have joined the combat department. There was also that one innocent student who happened to pass by but ran away in horror at seeing me carry a bunch of dead squirrels. Then Claire, Princess Peonia's head escort, also came to check on me to see how I was doing. How should I put it? Quite a few people now knew that I lived here in the northern forest. I hoped the news wouldn't reach the academic affairs office and end up causing me trouble. Well, not like the whole of Akan Island was managed by the school, so there shouldn't be a reason for them to kick me off of it immediately. I didn't have to be too scared of that possibility. But of the guests who would often visit me, there were 3 students who were particularly special. Guest A was a one-of-a-kind genius magician whose visits were at complete random. Sometimes, this guest would come over in broad daylight, when the sun was still high up in the sky. She would then lie down next to my campfire and sleep. Other times, she would come over at midnight where I would find her sleeping on the roof of my unfinished cabin. There was also that time I came back after hunting by the river to find her laying down on my hammock. She was looking at my cabin with big sparkling eyes. She must have felt like she now had a new secret base or hideout. She would then keep on asking me things like, "Hey, you know what? Are you going to make a chimney? Ooh, you installed a door. How about you build a back door too?" Even when I was cutting firewood by the riverside, she would just randomly appear from the top of a tree and say, "Can't you install a glass window instead? It won't collapse, will it? I shouldn't use my magic nearby. How about adding a window on the roof too?" And when I went to check up on the hunting snares I had set up, she would randomly pop out of bushes and ask, "Can I try using magic inside? How about laying down some marten skin inside, huh?" And then that time I was sharpening the blade of my dagger using a rock, she was right on top of said talk and kept on kicking her feet high up in the air to tell me, "While you're at it, why don't you try having the door open towards the sunlight? You know, they say you need 2 windows for the wind to circulate better." Anyone would think this punk was bullying me. I was getting sick of answering her questions and suggestion one by one that I ended up picking her up and throwing her into the wooden shelter. Every damn time. This was Guest A. Guest B was a second-year top student who was also quite the talented elementalist. I was rather welcoming of this visitor. Ta-da! I brought some eggs. Belle said it would be great if I could bring these to you, so I came to visit. She put down a basket of eggs by the campfire and did her classic, hee-hee, laugh. This was a neighbor who I was grateful for, since she would bring me food and other daily necessities that were rather difficult to find in the woods. Even though this elementalist kept on coming over every day, she would just sit down by the tree and read her books while she talked with spirits. It was a rather pleasant sight, so I allowed it. One day, she manifested a spirit that brought over a large washbowl and started boiling water out of the blue. "I'll show you something amazing. Don't worry about anything and just sit there, Ed." I didn't pay any mind to the faint laughter I heard coming from her direction as I kept on pouring mud into my brick casting by the river. I finally came over when it was time to eat and found her with her sleeves rolled up and her skirt tied high while she continuously stepped on something in the washbowl. I went to check what it was and I found my uniform shirt. It was a shirt that I had been washing like crazy with force enough to nearly tear the fabric apart. Even still, I had to keep wearing it the entire semester. Therefore, it was only inevitable that over time, things like dirt stains that couldn't be erased would pile up. This particular guest seemed quite uncomfortable with this shirt. Ta-da! I boiled salt water and pressed it down to make it white. Isn't it amazing? My parents used to do this when my clothes would get dirty back on our ranch. She then opened up the completely white shirt with a proud smile on her face. Seeing that smile made it look like she was waiting to get praised. I couldn't help it. I have her a round of applause. I kept on clapping and said, "You're the best. So cool. It's amazing how you know such things." She just lowered her head through all the praises, all awkward and shy. She was someone who would always do the opposite of what you would expect from her. There were some things that were quite obvious about her, but there were also things that I couldn't quite understand. For example, whenever Lucy would randomly show up out of nowhere, Guest B wouldn't even be surprised and give her greetings, nor ask me things like, "How often does Lucy come here?" She was truly someone whose actions couldn't be explained. This was Guest B. But the main point of this was Guest C. Guests A and B were people who relatively showed up quite often. There was no particular surprise meeting them, so I would just treat them as I usually did. But with Guest C, this thought came to my mind: why the hell is this person here? The sun was starting to slowly fade in the west, bathing the forest in red. My first arrow missed, so I ended up chasing after it for more than an hour. At the end of the day, I was able to catch a deer and hauled its corpse back into camp. Two unexpected people were waiting for me by the campfire. One of them was dressed in a neat maid uniform. She stood calmly, her two hands together. The other was sitting next to the fire, humming a song as she had her chin resting on the palm of her hand. "Oh my, Ed. I've been waiting for you. Your work must have taken quite a while." To the public, this person was called the Golden Daughter. She was Guest C. The occupation of Offellis Hall was an event that marked the start of Act 2, and would take place in Offellis Hall on the very last day of vacation. Just summarizing the main points would take quite a while. As the summer vacation came to a close, the lower-ranking students that had just returned to school would take over Offellis Hall, overcome by resentment towards the students who lived there for having special privileges and treatment. At the heart of it all was Wylane, the representative of lower-ranking students, whose speech spanned well over 20 chapters. They argued that top students who lived in Offellis Hall were guaranteed a life of aristocracy. They had permission to select seats first when taking classes, they had first choice when it came to eating, and they even have maids dedicated to them. These frustrations that had accumulated over time suddenly exploded due to an incident that happened during vacation. Heavy rain began to pour down in southern Balor, where Akan Island was located, just as the students were returning to school. However, the academy announced that they would only provide carriages and ships for students from Offellis Hall. The other students would need to figure out how to get back to the academy on their own. But not only that, the academy would only give them a few days to return before they are expected back. The lower-ranked students who had to endure the heavy rain as they traveled back to the academy, all the while in fear of having points deducted for arriving late, these students finally exploded. They met at Dex Hall and established a plan to come together and occupy the luxurious Offellis Hall and express their dissatisfaction. It wasn't a realistic plan, of course. Not only was Offellis Hall home to the top student in each grade, but even the maids who managed the dormitory were not easy opponents. Everyone in the building knew how to wield a rapier, and the senior maids even knew how to use intermediate magic. No matter how many low-ranked students gathered, there was no way for them to successfully take over Offellis Hall. It was like watching a group of lemmings swarming over a cliff from a distance. And even if they managed to occupy the dormitory, Offellis Hall was home to all sorts of aristocratic and influential people. This meant they would receive a heavy punishment. This made the scale of the situation a bit limited. But that was until Lortel intervened. The low-ranked students are talking about quite an interesting plan among each other. Lortel was smiling widely across the campfire. I kept sharpening the blade of my dagger without giving her much of a response. I looked up to check, and the person next to her was definitely Alice, the head maid of Offellis Hall. As if she was waiting for Lortel's orders, there wasn't anything strange about her quietly standing there without saying a word. She was the only person who had access to the protective magic inside Offellis Hall. And although it was called protective magic, slightly twisting it in a certain direction would enable you to use it in a totally different way. There was no reason to explain just how important having that level of authority was. Only those who have worked long enough at the academy, all while receiving the school's full trust, could qualify as the head maid. In other words, Alice was definitely not someone who could have been easily bought over with just a few coins. "So, I want to ask for your help. You need my help. You suit the role." Lortel deeply sighed and continued to talk. "Originally, the decoy I was going to have taught do the job, but he got himself seriously injured." I put the dagger that I was sharpening down at her words. This was a story that I couldn't just ignore. "Oh, you're finally going to seriously listen to me, huh, Ed? What about Tot? Decoy Tot. He didn't have a very important role, but it was a name I remembered clearly. He was the intro boss that appeared at the beginning of Act 2. His role was to get into an argument and get beat up by Taylor over vacation. He would later reappear as a one-phase boss in Act 2. Chapter 3, The Occupation of Ophelis Hall. It wasn't as big of an event as the Glasgow subjugation was, but this Ophelis Hall event would have enough influence in the later stories. It had 5 named bosses. The first floor boss, Decoy Tot. The second floor boss, Gloomy Clevius. The third floor bosses, Shaney, who is in charge of dishes, and Kelly, who is in charge of washing the beddings. The fourth floor boss, the representative of lower-ranked students, Wylane. The fifth floor boss, head maid Alice. First among these bosses was Tot. He was meant to set the atmosphere, get beaten up, and then disappear. If this was the original timeline, then he should have already been bought by Lortel to become part of the Ophelis Hall incident. How should I say this? That guy wasn't one to take things seriously. Plus he didn't seem that trustworthy at all, but he knew to keep his mouth shut, at least. So I thought I would go ahead and trust him, but then I didn't expect Ziggs to beat him up that badly. He's in the hospital right now. Something seemed to have fallen out of place in the timeline. I was sure there weren't that many influential large events that should have taken place over the vacation. Ziggs beat him up. Tot seemed to have gotten into a fight with Taylor and Ziggs. Seriously, why did he go ahead and do something stupid like that? So far, everything seemed to follow what I knew. Tot was another third-rate villain who was used at the beginning of Act 2. His only role was to get beaten up by the main character's group of friends after arguing over nothing. In fact, this character was only meant to make Ziggs look good. Tot came over and mocked the failed swordmaster, Taylor, saying his talent was fake. So Ziggs came over and hit him full on. Taylor and Ziggs would have gotten quite close during vacation, so it was only natural to start Act 2 with such an incident. I knew that was going to happen. However, it seemed like there were some parts one didn't know. For example, what did Tot specifically say to Taylor? He looked at Taylor and said, "You're not even as good as Ed Roth's Taylor, you're just a human that's even lower than an insect." Weren't his words too harsh? To tell you the truth, Taylor and you were both insulted at the same time, but Ziggs was the one who got twice as angry. This was why I was trying to minimize my involvement with any of the main characters. These situations were starting to become a bit too difficult to deal with. Elvira told me that Ziggs would have normally been a little upset, at the very least. But he seemed more angry than usual that day. Well, he did apologize after his anger faded away, but Tot was still a bit too emotional at that time. Lortel paused to catch her breath. I can't trust such an emotional person. Then she looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Your task is not that difficult. All you have to do is get the key from Alice, stay in Ophelis Hall for a while, and then open the door to let the lower-ranked students in. I'm sure there are a lot of other people who could do that other than me. There's actually not as many as you would think. No matter how the situation turns out, this is a job that needed someone to remain level-headed. And above all else, you have enough reason to participate." Why was Lortel telling me all this? Even if I bribed someone with enough money, there was no guarantee they wouldn't rat me out to the school's internal investigators once the incident is over. The person behind all this was actually the first-year student Lortel. If someone went ahead and confessed that, how do you think that would make me feel? There wouldn't be anyone I could trust. I finally understood why. Lortel picked me. I had already been kicked out of Ophelis Hall. I continued attending the academy despite getting ridiculed and looked down on by everyone. I didn't really care, if I were being honest. Ed Roth's Taylor deserved that kind of treatment in the first place. Sure, it was a little bit unfair to me, but right now, all I could really do was focus on my own survival. How students view me would fade over time, one way or another. The first years seemed to have actually started viewing me favorably. Don't you want to hit them back, Ed? Lortel smiled softly as she asked me. It seemed like she thought I was holding a grudge against the academy. Well, that was just pure speculation on her part. Not really. Oh, really? But sure, I'll listen to your terms first. I didn't panic and came to a conclusion right away. If I rejected Lortel's offer, she would just go and search for someone else to do it. That would just make me even more anxious. I wouldn't know would replace Tot then. I'd rather take the role, carefully open the door, then lose to Taylor. That was all his role was anyway. The only difference here was that Tot, the first phase boss, was currently unable to do his job. So as long as I was able to solve that issue, then the timeline would be able to go back to its original path. But that didn't mean I would just do it for free. Since Lortel was someone who would be able to pay me a lot, I ought to get as much as I could from her. 20 coins. The pay seemed ridiculously high for such a simple task. But considering the fact that I would need to keep quiet after, the calculation seemed correct. Since I wanted the timeline to progress as smoothly as possible, there was no reason for me to reveal Lortel's involvement in the first place. In fact, this would be pretty much free money to me. As long as I behaved well, then there wouldn't be a reason for them to investigate me. I'll just keep quiet and stay out of the spotlight. I'll send Taylor on his way up and then hide out in Yenikar's room for a while, maybe even drink a cup of tea, before escaping. Deal. I began sharpening my dagger once again. A signal that there was nothing more to talk about here. I had now become the first phase boss. I feel like something's wrong. It was night in the middle of the forest. The young merchant and the head maid walked side by side back to Ophelis Hall. The silent head maid, who had not spoken once, now spoke with a clear voice once she was alone with Lortel. He never asked, why. It was only natural for a veteran maid to see through people. At the very least, she could tell that Ed Roth's Taylor was not a regular person. They didn't have much to talk about, but it was funny how she had deduced that something was different about Ed with that level of conversation. However, whatever the head maid felt was strange, and Lortel clearly felt it too. It seemed that even you felt it too, Alice. Lortel smiled. Come to think of it, he had always been like that. There was no sense of curiosity from him, something that humans normally should have. With Lortel proposing such a thing, it would have been only natural for him to ask, why, countless times. Why did Lortel intervene in the Ophelis Hall occupation? Why was head maid Alice with Lortel? Why aren't you disgusted by this initiative from lower-ranked students? There were so many other whys he could have asked. They should have kept on coming. This was a backdoor transaction for 20 gold coins. It was only human nature to wonder what their purpose was. Why were they doing such a thing? Lortel had even prepared some believable lies beforehand. And yet, Ed Roth's Taylor only asked, why, once. Why are you asking me, of all people, to do it? With that kind of reaction, it only could be one of two reasons. He was someone not interested in anything else as long as he gets paid. Lortel felt her spine burning for the first time in a while. Or he was someone who was able to see through all of this. Lortel still clearly remembered the warmth of those 3 gold coins he had placed back in her hand. At the very least, Ed Roth's Taylor was not someone who would sell his life for gold. If so, using the process of elimination, there was only one possibility left. How much does he know? I don't think there should be any clues. Lortel closed her eyes gently before smiling her peculiar fox-like smile. It had been a long time since she had felt this feeling. This, fear of the unknown. It was getting late into the night. Lortel kept on walking through the darkness of the forest without hesitation. Back there, all he did as she excitedly kept on talking, was to sit there and sharpen his dagger across the campfire. She wondered what he was thinking after she left. She couldn't figure out what he was feeling, which only made Lortel's heart run even faster. Someone who was the same as her. To the point where it was terrifying. Chapter 32, The Occupation of Ophelis Hall 2. Among all her senses, Lortel was most confident with her sense of smell. After all, merchants survive in business by relying on it. The same was true for her. Someone with the business acumen to smell trends that others have yet to notice would enable them to act faster. And the opportunity to make quick and easy money usually came from that half-step difference. The way out of a tight situation also depended on that step. Proposal for assistance of Ophelis Hall students returning to school. Lortel folded the handwritten proposal in half as she sat at her desk in her room. She then put the letter inside an envelope and sealed it with some wax. As expected, it's been raining quite a bit. Raindrops splashed on her window. The gloomy sky only served to look like it agreed with how regrettable it was that vacation was coming to an end. More than half of the rooms in Ophelis Hall were still empty. The deadline for returning back to the academy was not until this weekend, which was when the dormitory would spring back up to life like usual. But before then, it would continue to be a lonely and quiet place. Lortel felt gloomy walking the dark corridors alone, the rain whipping against the windows as she passed. Though, like a paradox, the gloomy and dreary atmosphere was rather comforting at the same time. This land of learning had too many sources of light for her. There were the students, all of whom were full of hopes and dreams that a beautiful future was waiting for them. They devoted themselves to studying and were always so dazzlingly bright. Was this the light of adolescence? The term had always felt a bit awkward to her. But that was only natural as it was a completely unknown world to Lortel. A bright light would only reveal all the dirt on one's body. When she looked down at her desk, all she could see were papers full of depressing intentions. She was in contact with the representative of the lower-ranked students, Willane. With his teeth clenched, he was looking for an opportunity to get at the academy but also at the students living in Ophelis Hall. This ongoing heavy rain as everyone returned to school was a sure opportunity for him. If they were to create a random cause that the lower-ranked to average-ranked students could rally behind, the complaints would surely start piling up. The Willem would come in, a master instigator who was also a master orator. He would then use that incident as a trigger to finish up everything else. The head maid in charge of Ophelis Hall was already on Lortel's side, part of the Academy's administrative proposal review department as well. They would enthusiastically support Lortel's proposal for sure. It was a proposal to adjust when the Ophelis Hall students would need to come back to the Academy. It was a completely different treatment compared to an ordinary student who had to tough it out and return back to school in this heavy downpour. But it didn't matter if the school would accept Lortel's proposal or not. Just the fact alone that they would seriously consider such a plan would be enough to infuriate the other students. This peaceful atmosphere will soon be gone. This incident needed to be as big and grand as possible. The more property damage there was, the better. No, if possible, it would be for the best if the whole of Ophelis Hall itself was completely destroyed. On top of the ledger was the Academy's flow of money. This was completely Lortel's territory. The flow of funds and the structure of finances were things she could clearly deduce just by playing around with the Academy a few times. Sylvania's finances were already in a crisis. The repair work of Nail and Glocked Hall due to the Glaskin incident already required funds from the Elt Company. The Academy's chronic cash shortage would be easier than taking candy from a baby at this point. There wouldn't even be a need to open the school's financial records. Lortel had been able to clearly assess the situation with her own two eyes just by attending the academy for a semester. Estimating the school's quarterly cash flow would be easy to calculate with just a piece of paper, a quill, and some ink to write the formulas down. Headmaster Obel's perpetual external activities outside of school grounds also became clear. He had been trying to solve the cash bottleneck that had only gone worse this semester. The VIPs he had met were all extremely wealthy and influential people. He had been constantly running around on his own 2 feet with his sleeves rolled up, in search of a financier. The Academy's financial structure itself was not that bad. But having a payment due date would be a disaster, and could destroy even the most sturdy asset structures at once. Assets, and cash, were completely different concepts, after all. Bankruptcy caused by poor management was a reality that one needed to calmly accept. However, bankruptcies caused by a temporary cash bottleneck felt too unfair, to the point it could make blood flow from one's eyes. The Academy's management would do their best to stop that from happening. Lortel pushed her creaky chair back and leaned against the window. Ophelis Hall was the most luxurious and magnificent among all the buildings in the Academy. The dormitory was full of valuables and expensive pieces of art. The stained glass that was embroidered on the wall was handcrafted by a famous artisan whose name remained in history. The wallpaper, the carpet, and even the wooden furniture all were handmade by famous craftsmen. There were things that shouldn't even be in an academy. Noble families and other influential people had donated many pieces of art to inflate their egos. A bombastic incident right now would become a fatal blow to the school's finances since they were already in a tight spot. This would give the Elk Company an edge in the planned negotiations to purchase the Sage's Seal. The magic book was the heart of Sylvania, but for an academy that was truly on its last legs, putting its heart out on the negotiating table was inevitable. When will the rain stop? The rain continued its heavy downpour as Lortel looked out the window. No light could be seen under the gloomy sky. It looked like the sky she used to look up at from her shabby house in the ghettos. It gave her a sense of comfort. Whenever rainwater would drip into her shabby house in the ghettos, all the cockroaches that had been hiding in the corners would come out to find new cracks of darkness to hide into, avoiding the light. Lortel remembered the memory with a sense of kinship with the critters. This land of learning that was full of romanticism, had too many sources of light for Lortel. She, who had been living in darkness, her entire body that had been covered in dirt was clearer to see. The traces of a scheme lying on her desk were proof. The traces of a person who had always stabbed others in the back, doubted their own innermost thoughts, and lived a life devoid of sincerity. Her life had already become like this when she came to her senses after struggling to survive for so long. But none of that changed the fact that she was dirty all along. And so she became obsessed, wandering around, finding others who were just like her. Even in Sylvania, full of sparkling bright students, just maybe there was someone here who could sympathize with the life of a dirty gutter rat. Leaning on such fleeting hopes, Lortel looked up at the dark clouds in the sky and quietly said, "I'm lonely." No matter how hard she tried, her nature would never change. Her stance on how to survive in this miserable reality would always be the same. She was the man behind the curtain, as the audience called it. Life skills details. Grade, intermediate craftsman. Specialized fields, woodworking. Handicraft level 13. Design level 8. Foraging level 11. Woodworking level 12. Hunting level 8. Fishing level 6. Cooking level 6. Repair level 5. Advanced production technique slot, empty. Advanced production technique slot, empty. It was a heavy downpour. There had been times before when it rained a little bit, but this was the first long and ongoing heavy rain since I lived out here, surviving in the wild. Thankfully, I was able to set up a simple tent over the bricks I had been drying, but it was inevitable they would still retain some moisture from the air. If I had just a bit more time, maybe even just a week, then I could have used magic to finish drying them off and stored them separately. What awful timing. I would have no choice but to delay any outdoor work if it kept on raining like this. Well, of course, I would need to go out and hunt in the rain if I ran out of food. But I'm not exactly short on food right now, at least. I sat by the fire under a tent, quietly listening to the sound of the rain falling on top of me as I read up on the upcoming second semester elemental studies textbook. Rainwater kept on leaking inside my cabin, so I couldn't relax inside at all. It seemed the mud I roughly applied by itself did not make it completely waterproof. Just as I thought, I needed to think of how I was going to solve my flooring and inner wall issues. I was completely focused on my studies even on such a rainy day like this. The most important thing I needed to concentrate on was intermediate magic theory. Knowing how to do intermediate magic was a criterion for determining one's position as a professional magician. Knowing 3 or 4 different types of intermediate magic before the end of your 3rd year in the academy meant you were a magician who had already achieved a lot. I needed to work even harder. School would resume in 3 days. The occupation of Ophelis Hall would take place on the last day of vacation. The time was near. The Ophelis Hall occupation incident was a stepping stone event. Lortel used this event to put the Academy's finances in a tight spot before the main event of Act 2 began, which was the battle over the Sage's Seal, between the Academy and the Elk Company. It was an event that strengthened Lortel's position as the man behind the black curtain, someone who was manipulating things behind the scenes. For the players playing at that time, this was when the gap between Lortel and who she really was at its widest. Either way, I already knew what Lortel was planning, what her goal was, and what would happen. I didn't have any reason to intervene in Lortel's scheme. She was someone who needed to create a power able to rival Princess Penia's student council. She would form, the top, an independent interest group within the academy. From my experience when playing the game, I thought the balance of power between the two camps should be about the same. Princess Penia's idealism and tolerance have the power to unite the two groups. However, her high ideals were far from being realistic, thus creating contradictions and discrepancies in the academic policy. On the other hand, Lortel's realism and drive had the power to efficiently lead the groups, but her cruel and by-the-book judgment based on values and numbers made the members of her camp too cruel and cold-hearted. Ultimately, the important thing was which side Taylor would choose. Whichever side he would join would end up winning in the end. This meant I had to keep my eye on them to make sure I stick to the side that was most likely to win. If you just called me a complete opportunist, then you were absolutely right. It's better than being foolish, not knowing what was going on and then wasting precious once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. I also needed to eat to survive, you know. I should head back to the dorm now. I thought it would stop raining today for sure. It was only a little bit past noon, and yet the sky was gloomy and dark, as if it was already early evening. Yennecar squeezed her drenched skirt and went by the fire. You must be having quite a hard time, Ed. Since I have a place I go back to, it feels like I'm just out camping when I visit but you need to stay out here even when it rains like this. It will get better as time goes by. Perhaps it was because she had always enjoyed being in the northern forest in the first place, but Yennecar would often visit the camp and use the campfire to cook, or sit under a tree and read a book. Since the new semester hadn't started yet, Yennecar seemed to be using all her time for her own healing. Here, she didn't have to be conscious of other people's opinions and she could spend her entire days with the spirits she loved. Of course, this camp was where I desperately struggled to survive. In a way, it was kind of rude of her to keep coming here and treating it like some rest house. But considering all the tools and food she had been bringing, I thought it was a fair trade. Come to think of it, it's almost time for me to leave my room at Ophelis Hall. I guess it's almost time for that. That's why I have to start throwing away a lot of my excess junk. Dex Hall is a lot smaller than I thought. Students were expected to move into their dormitories a week before and after a new semester started. However, once classes started, students become busy and many ended up staying at Ophelis Hall for a few more days. They used the extra week to bring their luggage in or move it out. I wasn't sure when Yennecar would move out of her room, but the fact that she had already started to pack up now meant she would only be staying at Ophelis Hall for a few more days. So Ed, if you need anything, let me know. Don't you have a lot of things that you need? Really? Yeah, I have extra blankets, cushions, watches, lanterns, and such. Apart from those, I also have some daily necessities and consumables. It would be a waste to throw them all away, not to mention it would be quite a hassle to do so. Although if you need something like furniture, since that would originally be the dorm's property, I don't think I would be able to bring those out. I could make most pieces of furniture and other daily necessities as long as I had the materials. Plus it would be great for raising my proficiency level, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to receive whatever I could get. After all, it would be hard to solve everything through production alone. That would be great. Alright then. I'll be kicked out when the semester starts, so I'll bring everything then. Yennecar laughed as she warmed her hands by the fire. But, does Lucy do that often? Sometimes. Yennecar mentioned Lucy suddenly, as if that had been her main point from the beginning. Lucy was currently standing still on the roof of my cabin. Heavy rain was pouring down. The rain that had fallen on my skin wasn't particularly cold, but I was currently drenched in rainwater, an awful feeling. Lucy, on the other hand, had her silverish white hair tied neatly. It looked like it had been done by an Ophelis Hall maid. However, one side had already gotten wet and fallen loose. Her expensive school uniform was no longer properly doing its job of covering her. But Lucy paid no attention to all of that as she continued to stare up at the sky. She looked lazy, as she usually does. Like she had a few screws loose. Her clothes were all messed up and her big witch hat was crooked. However, she looked strangely different today. That could be because she was currently reminded of an archmage she had met on a rainy day just like this. The great power that was beyond common sense that Lucy had was not something she was given for free. A chain called fate had wrapped itself around her. Although she had been living her life trying to escape from it, using her laziness as an excuse. She lived her life not complicating things, ignoring her promised fate. But after a while of living as such, she finally came to her senses only to realize that so many years had already passed. On a rainy day like this, even that girl with a few screws loose would think back on her life. She seems to have a lot on her mind. How should I say this? Lucy has always been free-spirited. Something like that. It's fine. Just say she's a person who doesn't use her brain. That's too much. It couldn't be helped. I was just stating a fact. She sometimes acts like that when it rains. Don't worry about it too much. I tend to just ignore her. I see, Ed, you seem quite indifferent towards Lucy. Yennecar exclaimed as if she had found out something amazing. By the way, Yennecar. There was something I needed to check before she headed back to the dorm. Just like I had mentioned, the occupation of Ophelis Hall was not a big event. The scale of the incident itself was quite large, but there weren't many variables in play. The incident would start when the head maid Alice invoked a large-scale spatial defensive magic circle on the roof of Ophelis Hall. That magic circle made by the assistant headmaster Rachel was only accessible to the head maid and the general manager of Ophelis Hall. It was magic that was similar to that of a durable fire shutter. It was a high-ranking magic circle that covered every door, every window, every hallway, and every crack in Ophelis Hall. Of course, it was not something that could easily be broken. Late into the night before the first day of classes was set to resume, the students would all be busy cleaning up their rooms, and getting ready to leave early the next day for the opening ceremony. This spatial defensive magic circle was created to use against terrorism or if a disaster were to strike. Ironically, it ended up caging the Ophelis Hall students into their rooms like a barbed wire. All the maids would be oblivious to the situation since they were on their way to an emergency meeting in the staff room, but they also ended up getting locked in there. This would make the hallways of Ophelis Hall completely isolated. Those who would have access to these halls would be the students taking over Ophelis Hall or the maids who had teamed up with Alice. Other than them, only a few students would be lucky enough to be outside of their room when it happened, although the only two characters emphasized in the story were Clevius and Elvira. Of course, there were students who boast a ridiculous amount of strength, so they could have broken through the walls, or there were those who could have used all their magic power to escape from the spatial type magic. However, it was impossible for them to know exactly what the situation was like outside of their rooms. It was difficult to guess whether it was a temporary accident or a major disaster, and whether or not it would be resolved soon. Therefore, it was not an easy decision for the trapped students if they should use all their magic power or all their strength just before school started. The occupation of Ophelis Hall was planned around that, taking advantage of such thoughts. It was that complacency that would lead to the destruction of Ophelis Hall. What is it, Ed? I had called out to Yennecar just as she was about to head back to her dorm. I thought quietly to myself. Yennecar smiled innocently at my hesitation as she tilted her head. Either way, there wasn't much I needed to do that night. All I had to do was open the door at the right time, then check to make sure the magic circle was working until the lower-ranked students had occupied the 4th floor of Ophelis Hall. Taylor wouldn't have a choice but to enter Ophelis Hall because Elvira would have forgotten her precious medicinals in her room. Once Taylor and Elvira were inside, I could buy up a decent amount of their time before losing and then sending them upstairs. They would then enter Phase 2 where they had to capture Clevius, who had been running away in fear. There wasn't really much to it. Even if I tried, an unforeseen variable couldn't possibly happen. But I couldn't let my guard down. Didn't I already learn my lesson during the Glasgow subjugation? That the timeline could get twisted just because of one measly absurd reason. That's why I needed some insurance. A plan B. There was no harm in keeping some backup on standby to respond appropriately in case of possible emergencies. Yennecar was valuable manpower that no longer had any influence on the main story. She was perfect for the role. Besides, wasn't she the kind of person who would listen to her friend's request? To be honest, weren't we pretty close at this point? I have a favor to ask. What is it? Yennecar smiled widely as she waited for my response. I thought about it for a moment. How many students would be out late at night the day before school started? Most of the students would be resting in their rooms. Same for Yennecar if she hadn't left her room by then. If she was resting in her room, then she would be trapped by the magic circle summoned by the head maid. But if I were to keep Yennecar as my backup, then I should make sure she was waiting outside of Ophelis Hall. Though having her wait outside on a day when the heavy rain would be pouring down was a bit, but I couldn't have her too far away from the dormitory. Can you come out to the Rose Garden Pavilion in front of Ophelis Hall at around 9 o'clock in the evening the day before the opening ceremony? I would give her a detailed explanation then. It would be impolite to keep her here any longer when she was already trying to head back. I have something I want to tell you. Yennecar swallowed her breath in complete shock at my words. She looked around, as if making sure nobody else was there. She then lowered her eyes and held the hem of her skirt tightly. Sure, she agreed with a somewhat soft-spoken voice. And then quickly said, all right, I'll get going then, bye, and then disappeared into the woods. I wondered what was so urgent that she didn't even properly put on the hood of her robe which she had been using in place of a raincoat. Quote. I sat by the fire and slammed my book shut. I stared blankly at my cabin, my chin resting on my hand. Lucy was still blankly staring up at the sky. It continued to rain heavily. The sound of the raindrops falling on the tent calmed me down somehow. The forest after the rain smelled different than usual. The soggy smell of grass was thicker. The rain would stop on the morning of the first day of school. I would then be able to see the dazzling sky which I haven't seen for quite a while now. After that, the forest would start to smell like fall. I hoped this event would finish up quickly so I could start thinking about honing my advanced production skills. I thought about it some more as I sat down and threw a couple more pieces of firewood into the campfire as I listened to the falling rain. The long vacation was finally coming to an end. Chapter 33 The Occupation of Ophelis Hall 3. Tomorrow will be the start of the second semester. While training alone in his room, it suddenly occurred to Ziggs Eifelstein that quite a decent amount of time had passed. As he looked out his window, the pouring rain beyond it failed to raise his spirits. Due to the gloomy weather of the last several days, he hadn't been able to start his day with his usual jog. The conditions weren't great for training his magic power outdoors, either. His plan to train as much as he could over the vacation was ruined. He had planned on developing various basic skills to keep up his progress in the class, but he still felt that it was a long way off. Professor Glast's curriculum for Class A was quite daunting for Ziggs, who didn't have a knack for learning. While Lucy was out of the question due to her tendency to solve every problem with her overwhelming level of magic power, he wanted to watch and learn from Lortel's delicate use and management of her magic power, as well as her ability to solve problems and adapt quickly. Although Ziggs was considered ahead of her in terms of practical combat skills, he was far behind Lortel in terms of know-how and the skills required to thrive in a civilized society. I really need to stop letting my emotions cloud my judgment. Ziggs let out a heavy sigh. His companion, Elka, was genuinely angry that he had beaten up Tot in a moment of rage. It was very rare for Elka to get angry at Ziggs. In the end, it was Ziggs who went to Tot and apologized, even though his anger hadn't fully faded. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the garden through the pouring rain. Wearing a robe as they ran through the rain, they entered Ophelis Hall. It was definitely the guy that lived in the cabin in the northern forest. Wasn't he kicked out? If he is trying to force his way into Ophelis Hall, the maids will just kick him out. He was worried that that guy might get hurt unnecessarily, but Ziggs already knew him all too well. That was why he didn't have to worry about such a thing happening. Ziggs leaned back and looked away from the window. Once you opened the main door of Ophelis Hall, you could see the first floor main hall. Every time a student entered the dormitory, the maid in charge of the entrance would quickly check them before letting them in. Unless you wore the red brooch that was given to those allowed in Ophelis Hall, it was impossible for them to check you in and let you enter. Additionally, the maids memorized the faces of all 53 students staying in the dormitory, so you couldn't fool them. You must be Sir Ed. I received the message from the head maid. Originally, I would have had to stand in the rain in front of a tightly closed entrance. However, today Offelus Hall was open. Kelly, who was in charge of laundry. She had a small figure and was neatly dressed in the lower maid's uniform. She was one of the mid-bosses in the occupation of Offelus Hall event. There was no way that the loyal Offelus Hall maids would willingly participate in the occupation. However, Shani and Kelly, who were trained and raised by head maid Alice, were different. They were persuaded to participate in the plan by Alice. Shani, who wielded a rapier, was in charge of being the vanguard. Kelly was to take control of the hallway with her decently high proficiency in beginner magic. Although you would meet them on the third floor as enemies, they honestly weren't all that difficult to deal with as opponents. As long as you could defeat Kelly, who was in charge of the firepower, it would be easier than you'd think to break through. Well, that was all something that Taylor would take care of. It would have been a disaster if you were any later. We're going to switch rotations soon. Anyway, right now Kelly was still in charge of the entrance. As she was instructed in advance, she let me enter Offelus Hall. Soon, I'll be switching places with another maid to go take care of my work. Solara might be a child, but she is a new maid. Still, you should be able to defeat her without much force. She shouldn't be carrying anything like a weapon on her. Is it okay for a little kid to be in charge of the main entrance? It's not that difficult of a job to identify and let people in. In the event of an emergency, there is also a magic tool that allows you to contact the head maid directly, but today she won't answer the call. I nodded my head. I would hide inside the hall and, when the time arrived, I would defeat the maid that was guarding the entrance and open the doors. The lower students would then enter and proceed upstairs. By that time, head maid Alice would have activated Offelus Hall's defensive magic circle. That would seal off the entrance to each room. All I would have to do then is walk around the first floor and check that the magic was working. From there, once I determined that there wouldn't be any problems, I would come back to the first floor's main hall and wait for Taylor. According to the original timeline, the members that would overcome this event were Taylor, Ayla, Elvira, and Clevius. However, Clevius wouldn't join up with them until the second floor, so all I had to do was deal with the other three. What about the other maids? I looked down the empty hall as I questioned Kelly. Other than essential personnel, most of them have gathered in the conference room. The head maid gathered them all there, saying there was an important issue to discuss. She was thinking of putting them all in a room and sealing the entrance. As expected, once the head is hired on, the plan becomes quick and easy. I have prepared the things that you requested. Kelly groaned as she brought out a basin near the entrance. It was filled with a thick liquid. Oh, thank you. Should I just leave it in the corner? I nodded and looked up at the hall. As it was such a luxurious building, it was glamorous even from the entrance. The main hall's marble floor was sparkling clean. The height of the ceiling was high, making it feel like you were still outdoors. A magnificent chandelier hung from the ceiling, and smaller chandeliers were hung around it. It gave off the impression of stars decorating the moon. As you looked and walked around the center of the hall, it was enough to make you feel quite lonely. The decorative cabinets lining the wall, and even the stone door leading to the hallways, were antiques. The walls and floor are all made out of marble. It was definitely a luxurious place. I had already visited this place from Taylor's point of view as a part of the storyline, but seeing it in person was definitely different. I opened the door of a cabinet that was in the corner and put some of the things I had prepared inside. After grasping the location and structure of various things in the hall, I nodded my head and made a rough estimate of what would happen next. Following the original timeline, the boss battle on the first floor wasn't anything special. It just took a bit of time. The key was to take up just a little bit of Taylor's time before he moved on to the second floor boss battle. Once that was over, the rest would probably go smoothly. The boss on the second floor was Gloomy Clevius. It was an event where you would have to chase after Clevius, who broke down a wall because he was afraid of being alone, despite the fact that nothing major had happened yet. It was a scenario in which Clevius, who kept saying he was going to run away, was subdued and then forced to join the party. So until I heard Clevius break down that wall, I needed to stall for time. It was my job to make sure that the timing lined up perfectly. I had no choice but to admit it. There was something that I had realized during Act 1's boss fight, and that was that the butterfly effect was truly unpredictable. The fact of the matter was, having the determination to try and control every single variable in the world was nothing more than arrogance. Therefore, once the boss fight on the first floor was completed, I would go out to the rose garden and watch the situation until the very end with my backup, Yennecar. That way, we could respond immediately if any abnormalities occurred. It's an opportunity to check out Taylor's specs. If his specs weren't enough to clear this event, it'd be a big problem. In particular, the final boss of Act 2, Inquirer Glast, was a terribly painful opponent. His celestial magic and curses would make you experience the pain of being stabbed with an awl constantly, which would eventually break your heart. It was hard to deal with unless both your stats and mental strength were well trained. I made sure that I had put all the things I had prepared into the cabinet and snapped the door shut. After that, everything went smoothly. As I hid between the main hall's cabinets, a little after 8 o'clock the new maid and Kelly changed shifts at the front door. We won't stand by and be treated like this anymore. This is a land of learning. At least ensure equality in grades. Answer our voices. The cries of the lower and regular students echoed through the main entrance. They gathered in front of the locked Ophelis Hall, chanting loudly. The person at the front, leading it all, was the representative of the lower students, Willain. He had short, light blonde hair and horn-rimmed glasses. The brown-gray robe he was wearing was already soaked by the rain. Ophelis Hall symbolized the nobility of the privileged students that attended Sylvania. The students gathered together in front of that symbol, sitting down and studying. Originally, it was all supposed to just end there. They didn't have a choice but to sit and express their dissatisfaction and resentment towards the privileged students. That was because Ophelis Hall's front door was shut tight. What is this? I need to report this to the head maid. The new maid, who was taken aback by the sudden situation, trembled as she began to look for the magic tool she was given. Taking advantage of her confusion, I quickly jumped behind her and covered her eyes with a scarf. Ughawk, what's happening? Who are you? I lifted the blindfolded maid up onto my shoulder, holding her wrists together tightly with one hand so that she couldn't untie the scarf. I then unlocked the front door with my other hand and kicked it open. Hua, what? The group of students, taken aback by the sudden change in situation, started to panic. However, Ophelis Hall's door has opened. Let's go inside. The representative Willain shouted as the crowd suddenly rushed into the hallways of Ophelis Hall. The management office is on the 4th floor. Let's take over the 4th floor and issue our statement. Let's make our voices heard. Equal treatment. We don't want much, just equal treatment. Let's go. Let's show them our potential. I watched the crowd of students roaring in as I continued holding onto the maid. You're Ed Roth's Taylor. The third-year student Willain, who was leading the charge, reacted after seeing me. It seemed that even the third years knew of my name. It was you who Lortel had ended up hiring. Yes, I'm in charge of being the lookout on the 1st floor. Why are you? I used the lines that I had prepared beforehand. There was something that I deeply sympathized with amidst the words that you've been shouting. Of course, I lived a comfortable life in Ophelis Hall before, but once I was kicked out, I realized just how privileged I was. Quote, Ed Roth's Taylor. I have just come to realize it. Everything that you said was right. Until I was kicked out, I was a part of the privileged class. Because of that, I couldn't relate to the words you were saying. Now I must prove myself through my actions. At those words, Willain's hands trembled in admiration. Ed Roth's Taylor was a man who had lived a life of privilege before being kicked out of that cozy cradle. The more human you became, the more you started to realize just how many privileges you enjoyed. That's great. You really have contributed so much to our demands for equal rights. I didn't realize that you were such a righteous person. I heard the rumors and ended up judging you so unfairly. Of course not. I used to be such a terrible person. The only thing that happened was that I was so impressed with what you said, and I just did all that I could. It was all thanks to you, Willian. I responded with that before I urged Willian to hurry on. Please, go upstairs immediately. You need to hurry up to the 4th floor management office to issue a statement. All right. Thanks for your help. Willian was in a position to accept all the responsibility once this incident finished. He would be subject to a heavy punishment for the act of instigating students and urging them to violate school regulations. If all of the students here were severely punished individually, the school would never return to normal. That's why they would decide to use his punishment to make an example out of him. The students who had simply participated in Willian's plan incitement, thus engaging in destructive behavior. Compared to Willian, they would only receive a mild punishment. It wasn't beneficial for me to be disciplined over nothing, but considering the importance of 20 gold coins and being able to keep the timeline flowing smoothly, it was an acceptable risk. That is why the key was to keep on stating, I'm only taking action because I was moved by what Willian said. And, I am only following Willian's goals. I needed to make sure all the responsibility that I had would fade away from me as much as possible. Though, Willian had no intention of destroying Ophelis Hall. He had just intended to peacefully end the situation by simply occupying the dorm and then officially issuing a statement, but everything doesn't go the way you plan. I'm sorry, but, no matter what I do, I'm in a position of facing heavy punishment. It should be fine to just ride on his back, right? Head up quickly, Willian. All right. I won't forget you, Ed. You're the best underclassman. I am sorry. Stay strong, Willian. The gentle light coming off the magic circle filled the dark hallway. At the entrance to each room, the defensive magic was doing its job perfectly. What the hell is going on out there? Is it really fine to just stay in my room like this? Is anybody out there? The door won't open. Can I break it down? It looks expensive though. I saw a bunch of students rushing in through the window. Just what the hell is going on? If I just wait, then it will all be restored, right? It's not a big deal, is it? As I crossed the hall, I heard the voices of the confused students in their rooms. The first floor was mostly full of third years. I checked each room carefully to ensure that there weren't any missing magic circles. If the story went the same as in the original timeline, then there wouldn't be any magic circles missing. But even so, I still wanted to make sure of it with my own 2 eyes. After about 15 minutes of inspection, I came back to the first floor hall and found something that I didn't want to see. Outside the wide-open main gate, it was pouring rain. I didn't see the new maid anywhere. Surely she must have just gone to report the situation to her superiors. Unfortunately for her, they all should have been locked up in the 4th floor conference room. The marble floor, which had always been kept sparkling clean, was completely dirty from the muddy shoes that rushed in. Some of the cabinets and shelves were completely knocked down. Oh my, it started much more impressively than I had thought. The girl pushed her way through the heavy rain and entered, shaking off her clothes. As expected of you, Ed. I'm glad that I trusted you. She smiled while taking off her wet robes. Pulling down her hood, she revealed pure white skin. EGHK. My socks got all wet, too. This is why I hate rainy days. So you were watching from outside, Lortel. I couldn't determine if the situation was going well or not if I was trapped in my room. Also, I had to make sure that the students were all gathered up outside. But I didn't expect it to rain this much. EGHK. Even the inside is all wet. Lortel smiled like a fox as she took off her robe and shook it. Her casual clothes, a white one-piece and skirt, that she was wearing underneath it were all soaked through. They looked terrible. She grabbed her reddish-brown hair, which was unusually loose, with one hand to dry it out. As she did, she used her other hand to roll up her robe once she had shaken off all the water. If the school staff gets involved, we'll quickly be defeated. We have to get things moving before then. All right. Work hard. Lortel grinned as she finished tidying up. Then she made her way down the hall. She'd probably head up to the 5th floor to discuss the plan with Alice. The situation would get more intense once they handed over the magic circle, which was covering Ophelis Hall with defensive magic, to the representative of the lower students, Willian. Then, the representative of the lower students, Willin would become the fourth-floor boss, with all of the different kinds of defensive magic that protected Ophelis Hall. According to the storyline, you were forced to defeat Willane, who was unable to come to his senses because he was caught up in the endless magic circles running wild, as quickly as possible. Ed, can I ask you something that's a little out of the blue? As if she had a thought in mind, Lortel paused on her way down the hall as she spoke to me. The question she asked was unexpected. Have you ever killed someone before? Lortel's voice was still as lively as ever, but the atmosphere suddenly felt as dreary as the weather. I frowned as Lortel let out a laugh, before she smiled and turned her back to me. Her drenched reddish-brown hair was gathered together, cascading down to her shoulders. I haven't. Neither have I. Ha ha. Then Lortel continued to speak, as if she were confessing. But, I've done a lot of similar things. Lortel's past was by no means clean. All of the tricks and acts of fraud she had committed while a part of the Elt store were actions that would have ultimately led to the destruction of someone else. It may not have been a crime when compared to murder, but it was in line with ending another person's life. Lortel knew that fact better than anyone else. At first, I had to survive. To survive in a reality that was like a thorny path, it seemed all too natural to stab someone else in the back. The first few times you did it, you might have felt a sense of guilt. That, however, would soon disappear. After accepting the honorable title of a wealthy merchant, there were suddenly a lot of people that she had to step on. The world was full of people that, whenever they had a chance, would put a dagger in their own heart. After making it that far, she had begun to wonder if she had been living the wrong life. She had trampled on other people's lives in order to survive, and to prevent herself from being stabbed in the back, she had betrayed others first. She had lived a life committing such acts with such excuses, but when she thought about it deeply she realized that it was merely self-justification. Ed, what do you think of such a person? Even though she had realized it later, that didn't mean that all the stains on her body would be gone. After that, whenever she did a good deed, it would only be considered hypocrisy. She also could never make the bold decision to give up all the wealth that she has built up over her life. Now that she had come this far, she could never turn back. She knew too many of the ugly secrets hidden by several tradesmen, aristocrats, and other influential people to escape from a life of commerce. The moment Lortel's name lost its value, it would be over. In the end, she had no choice but to run towards the final train station like a runaway locomotive on its tracks. She had come too far now to be hypocritical. As a merchant, a villain, and as a black curtain, the moment she took her first step in that swamp, it began to eat her up little by little. By the time she had come to her senses, her whole body was already settling in the darkness. Who was she going to ask to save her? It was a disaster that she had brought upon herself. She knew better than anyone that she didn't deserve sympathy. That's why she was searching for someone just like her. If it were you, Ed, would you sympathize with such a person? Because I was already in the sewer up to the top of my head, I understood the truth. I could also never be fully accepted or sympathized with. Regardless of the good or the bad, the feeling of loneliness would come, just like it came for her. The only way to escape that loneliness was to find someone like herself, someone that was also stuck rolling in the mud. She could only be saved once she found someone else that would become used to living at the bottom of the swamp with her. No, of course, that person isn't me. You should be responsible for your own choices, Lortel. Hearing those words, Lortel's face blanked for a moment before she finally smiled. You're right. Lortel Kehaland was a girl who had lived her whole life only pursuing reason and rationality. I was already tired, knowing that fact all too well. Until the day that the storyline for Sylvania's failed swordmaster came to an end, she would not once show a loss of rationality or become obsessed with anything. I shouldn't have brought up such nonsense. Sorry about that. Hey. Lortel's expression quickly returned to her mischievous smile as she quickly rid herself of her emotional expression. I should quickly get to my job, then. There's not much time. With those words, Lortel climbed up the stairs and disappeared. I nodded my head as I picked up a chair that had fallen over and took a seat. From that moment on, I would sit still and wait for Taylor to come in. Anyway, I was already familiar with the stats and skills that Taylor, Ayla and Elvira would have during Act 2. Even with the absolute difference between our numbers and stats, that alone wouldn't be enough to defeat me easily. Though, it wasn't like I had to defeat them completely. I just had to waste some of their time. It wasn't even that big of a deal. As long as I bought some time before losing, Taylor would go on up to the second floor. Still, as we fought there was the risk of a few hits landing or injuries being sustained. Well, it would be a necessary sacrifice. Why is there a carriage this late at night? Sitting in the corner of the Rose Gardens pavilion, a short distance away from Ophelis Hall, Yennecar looked down the main road. A magnificently large carriage passed in front of the Rose Garden. She had never seen such a luxurious carriage before. The golden crown that was drawn on top of it was quite impressive. It seemed like there might be some type of great person visiting. Something that I need to take care of suddenly came up, so I might be a little late. I'll be there as fast as I can, so please just wait a little longer. I'm sorry. She folded the note that Ed had left behind and held it close to her chest, staring at the pouring rain amidst the beautiful roses. This was actually a good thing. She had time to calm herself down. Did he prepare anything else? The Rose Gardens pavilion was somewhere that she had seen every day. This was because it was a place that was right in front of the main entrance of Ophelis Hall, along the path you'd take as you walked towards the teacher district. It was late at night, so she couldn't see the entirety of Ophelis Hall. However, she could still see part of it through the rain. It felt like some type of accident had occurred. Many students seemed to be heading toward Ophelis Hall, and just now a huge carriage had disappeared in the direction of the dorm. Yennecar was curious, but she didn't move. She didn't want to move unnecessarily and accidentally miss Ed. For the last 3 days, she had been unable to sleep as she kept thinking, what is it that Ed wants to tell me? Perhaps, was it that? No way, maybe she was just overreacting. Or was there another reason for him to have called her there? Talking to herself and saying such things made her close friends worry about her. Though she felt guilty about it, she kept on listening to Merylda about every move Ed made. More people than she had realized knew about Ed's camp. Merylda said that she had seen not only Lucy, but also Princess Peenia, Belle Maya, and even Lortel of all people visit Ed's camp. Merylda didn't keep close surveillance on him 24 hours a day, so there could have even been more people that came out to visit him that she didn't yet know of. The fact that most of the people who visited were female students was heartbreaking for Yennecar, but she wasn't in a position to fuss about it. What would it be like to be in a position to meddle about it, anyway? Such thoughts made the blood rush to her head again. I shouldn't have worn this. Does it not suit me? After not wearing it for some time, she had come out wearing an orange persimmon hairpin that had been sent from back home. She had brushed her hair out once more as well, and made sure that her clothes fit nicely, with no wrinkles. As she came all the way out here, she had started to think that the Cosmos pin she wore at the festival was prettier. She didn't think that it went well with what she was wearing, as it was dark outside and it was hard to see. Maybe a brighter color would have been better. Should I just go and change my clothes now? Yennecar continued to sit still in fear of missing Ed, even as a crowd of students and a large wagon passed by. It would be ridiculous to go all the way to her room now, just because of a hairpin. Maybe if I quickly run there and back, it will be okay. Once you make up your mind, it's better to take action quickly rather than waste time. Yennecar swallowed her saliva as she ran out back into the rain with her robes. Hood on. She was worried that her hair, which she had tried so hard to keep nice, would get ruined by the hem of the hood. Even so, Yennecar ran quickly. If her hair did end up a bit messy, she would just have to hurry up and fix it in her room. Is it really the right decision to enter Ophelis Hall? Do you know how much all the herbs I have in my room cost, Taylor? Still, isn't it better to wait for the school to take care of the situation themselves? The rain was falling heavily. In front of the main entrance to Ophelis Hall, Taylor, Ayla, and Elvira were arguing. If I don't collect the herbs on time and use preservation magic on them, they'll change properties. The difference in the smallest details can change the results of the entire experiment. Do you know how important that is, Taylor? Elvira puffed her cheeks as she grilled Taylor. Elvira was actually secretly testing reagents in a secret laboratory built on a cliff along the coast without the school's permission. Because of that, she didn't really want to get entangled with the Ophelis Hall incident in the first place. Even so, the herbs that she had left in her room were bothering her so much that she ended up grabbing anyone she could see, making a fuss to get them to help her get into Ophelis Hall. Those sacrifices were Taylor and Ayla. They're all just a bunch of lower students, so the three of us can beat them up. All we have to do is take care of the leader, Willain. As she said as much, Elvira began to take long strides towards the entrance of Ophelis Hall. Ayla, stop her. She's trying to enter Ophelis Hall by herself. See, can't we just pretend that we don't know? Elvira is a top student in the alchemy department, she should be good enough to take care of herself. It's not Elvira who is in danger, it's the lower students. Elvira is just going to spray whatever reagents she has in their eyes. Hearing those words, Ayla gulped. Elvira, who was currently behaving completely out of character, really could end up throwing all sorts of reagents at the lower students. Taylor was right. It wasn't Elvira who was in danger, it was the lower students. Taylor and Ayla followed Elvira, who was hastily walking towards the front entrance of Ophelis Hall. Elvira, stop nagging and follow me already. I need you to come help me break through, all the way to my room on the 4th floor. Then, will it be fine if we just take you to your room? You're not going to do anything else. Exactly. I only need to keep the herbs safe, after all. Taylor let out a sigh once he heard those words, tying up his hair. All right. Then, let's go to your room, Elvira. If there's anyone blocking my path, I'm going to break my way through them. Got it, Taylor. Please don't go around hurting people, Elvira. Taylor said those words as he looked at Ayla. Taylor's companion, Ayla, sighed deeply as she followed the two of them. After a short while, they reached the front of Ophelis Hall. Elvira quickly kicked open the front entrance. The door opened with a bang as the first floor's spacious main hall came into view. In the center of the hall, all by himself, a man was sitting in a wooden chair. The man lifted his head, observing the party that entered Ophelis Hall's first-floor hall as the sound of the rain filled the room. Act 2, Chapter 3, The Occupation of Ophelis Hall. The first-floor boss that was different from the original timeline. The fallen aristocrat that was excommunicated, Ed. Just like the day he had defeated Taken, he sat with his arms folded and hands clasped together as he waited for the party. Chapter 34 The Occupation of Ophelis Hall 4. The rain was still falling heavily outside. The sound of rain falling echoed throughout the wide main hall of Ophelis Hall. After Taylor and his party came in and closed the main entrance, the sound was replaced with the tapping of the rain hitting the outer wall. Lightning struck, briefly lighting up the hall. Ed was sitting in the center of the hall, greeting Taylor and his party with a blank expression. Ed, Roth's Taylor. Though he had been excommunicated from the family and no longer had the right to call himself a Roth's Taylor, for Taylor that name would always be the same. Why are you here, in Ophelis Hall? Taylor's voice was cold. It has been nearly half a year since the incident and his emotions had subsided quite a bit, but for Taylor, Ed Roth's Taylor was a person he could never become close with. Ellipsis. Both Ayla and Elvira were well aware of this fact. Quote ellipsis quote. Elvira quickly understood the situation that was developing in front of her. The marble floors of Ophelis Hall, which were always kept sparkling clean, were now covered with muddy footprints. Cabinets had fallen over, no longer in place. These were the leftover traces of the group of students that had gone charging through, and the man sitting quietly in the center had to be guarding the path. Ha. What should I say? This is by no means a normal situation. This is too fun. It's beyond my expectations. Elvira let out a loud laugh. She didn't know everything that was happening, but what she did know was that things were going to get interesting. I'm sorry, but Ed, who was still sitting in the middle of the hall, spoke. I can't let you go any further than this. If they were to ask why. Naturally, there was no reason for him to answer. There was no sign or implication that he would do so. Even though he didn't express it with words, it was written in his appearance as he sat there with his mouth closed and his face expressionless. Following that, Elvira's response was obvious. Haha, this is too fun. Do you really think you can stop me if I say that I'm going to pass? Elvira Aniston was a first-year student in Sylvania Academy's alchemy department. Students in the alchemy department didn't train directly for combat. Most of the students focused on interpreting the structure of magic, exploring the properties and sources of matter, and analyzing and studying the efficiency of various herbs and magic reagents. However, if you were to ask if it's okay to ignore students in the alchemy department when it came down to a combat situation, the person being asked would have no choice but to shake their head in denial. The students of the alchemy department owned all sorts of magic reagents, wore different types of magic tools, and could easily control the entire battlefield. They were joker cards that created variables in combat-related situations and had the power to completely reverse the difference in power. Seeing the students of the alchemy department overflowing with their uncontrollable antics even made the professors in charge of them admire them. Even though the magic department was rumored to be full of freaks, the alchemy department was even worse than them. Elvira Aniston was considered to be the biggest freak in the entirety of the alchemy department. Though she didn't specialize in direct melee combat or magic, she was at least at a level where she wouldn't be pushed around by a second year who could only use beginner magic. Elvira chuckled loudly. If you don't want to get hurt, you'd better move aside. Already, Taylor was giving Ed a look dripping with hostility. The fact that Ed, who had very little to do with this situation, was sitting in such a place and blocking their way, seemed to have made him fully aware that something was wrong. It didn't seem that this story would end with a peaceful demonstration and statements from the lower students. That gut feeling began to bother the entire party. Even then, the situation itself was still not too burdensome. Even though Ziggs had once said that Ed's beginner magic proficiency was quite excellent, right now his lack of absolute firepower and the sheer difference in numbers between them was something that couldn't be overcome. It was 3 vs 1. A swordsman that was starting to hone his skills, a magician who could use magic at an average level of a first year, and an alchemist who boasted the greatest skills amongst her grade level. Ed continued waiting in the middle of the hall, looking quite intimidating. But that didn't mean he would be able to overcome the overwhelming gap in power. Taylor drew his sword. What is your purpose here, Ed Roths-Taylor? Tell me what is going on upstairs, right now. Ed didn't open his mouth as he sat still, continuing to stare at the party. If that's the case, I'll just have to force you to open your mouth. With those words, the battle began. Taylor kicked off the ground as Ayla got into position and started gathering mana. The moment that Elvira tried to reach into her alchemy bag, which was filled with all sorts of reagents, Ed kicked his chair and stood up. Crash! The chair was rolling around on the floor as Ed began to gather magic power in his hands. Elvira could immediately grasp the flow and basis of that magic power. It was the beginner-level wind magic, Wind Blade. But who was the target? Taylor, Ayla, or Elvira? Out of the three, the one that Ed, as a magician, had to be the most conscious and could only be achieved when they could continuously gather magic power and cast magic. In a battle between magicians, maintaining distance was less important. But when there was a fighter that was skilled in close combat involved, it became the key to victory. As soon as the swordmaster closed the distance, a magician's chance of winning was completely gone. That meant that the first target that Ed would try to take down was Taylor McClure, who was approaching him. Meanwhile, if Elvira and Ayla's supporting fire hit Ed, it would be an extremely easy victory for the subjugation team. Whoosh! However, his wind blade wasn't directed towards the party, it was instead aimed at the sky. The blind spot in their train of thought, the ceiling. In the luxurious and large main hall, a single stroke cut the connection that was supporting the chandelier. With a screech of metal, the huge chandelier crashed right into the center of the main hall. Of course, there was easily enough time for Taylor to react. The forward momentum of his body was offset by him having to quickly kick off the ground in the opposite direction. After a short while, the main chandelier stood in the spot where Taylor had been moving. Dust rose, obscuring the view of the hall. Kaya, Ayla, are you okay? I'm fine, Taylor. I just fell down because of the shock, that's all. After the loud crash that filled the hall faded, the sound of people talking started to fill Ophelis Hall. The students that were trapped in their rooms were starting to get anxious. They seemed to be starting to seriously consider breaking down the walls and doors of the expensive building to escape. The first one to succumb to that fear was Clevius, but it didn't seem that he had come out of his room quite yet. "Elvira, are you? Don't worry about." Elvira's bound citrus-colored hair flew. A few strands were cut by the wind blade. As it flew through the air, the blade's target hadn't been Elvira's hair, but rather the bag she was wearing, the one that was full of alchemy supplies. The leather was torn and the magic reagents that were inside were pouring out. Ed choosing to send the large chandelier crashing into the floor without any hesitation had been completely unexpected. They thought that, after trading blows for a few rounds, they would eventually be able to defeat him. The antique interior of Ophelis Hall had given off an atmosphere that it should never be damaged. The unconventional act of destroying that expensive-looking chandelier without any hesitation, how was he going to take responsibility for that? It seemed to Elvira that Ed's behavior was reckless, but Ed Roths-Taylor was never the type of person to do something so drastic. If things went according to plan, the entirety of Ophelis Hall would end up completely destroyed. Nobody would care about the fact that the main hall was ruined, nor would they end up being held accountable. Since he knew that fact quite well, to him even that magnificent chandelier was seen only as a tool to create a variable in the fight. Of course, from Elvira's point of view there was something wrong with Ed's attempt to prevent the party from entering any further. Looking at that means that he's serious, right? There must be something going on upstairs. Elvira looked back at the reagents that were scattered all over the floor. All kinds of low-grade reagents had fallen, but none of them were broken. After all, these were reagent containers that were reinforced using a spell cast by Elvira. Until Elvira cancelled the spell, the bottles wouldn't lose their strength. The moment Elvira tried to move her body towards them, a pillar of fire extended from Ed, separating Elvira from the reagents. That wall of fire that stretched out in a straight line was created by the beginner magic, Ignite, but the scale and heat itself wasn't normal. It was the results and a clear sign of his extremely repeated practice and his mastery of Ignite. Ed's fire wall divided the main hall into pieces, as if he was cutting cake. A 2, 3, 4-layered wall of fire. The flames surrounding the chandelier separated the main hall into separate spaces. This isn't good. Building a battlefield naturally, like the flow of water, Ed Roths-Taylor's judgment was quick and accurate. Elvira was the core of the subjugation team. However, the most fatal drawback for an alchemy student was that they had almost no direct combat power unless they could rely on their magic tools or reagents. Even if it was just a bag full of her alchemy supplies, Elvira's power was halved just because the contents had fallen out. With the wall of fire set up, she wouldn't be able to reach them. Usually, alchemy students wore emergency magic tools in the form of a ring or necklace. Elvira, who was overconfident in her skills, didn't do so because it was too much of a pain. She wondered if it was really possible that he had predicted this moment to that extent, but she shook her head as if admitting that there was no way he would be able to do such a thing. Anyway, using such a large scale, Ignite, would be difficult in the long term for Ed, whose amount of magic power was average. It looked like he was aiming for something. KGHK. There was a very brief moment where she had lost concentration at the shocking sight of the chandelier falling down. It ended up being a big mistake that allowed him to throw out an attack without any hesitation, with full determination to hit her bag. Fortunately, there's still some things left. Elvira took out a small glass object from her shirt. It was a magic tool in the shape of a rabbit. That magic tool had been left out in advance because there was something else that she was researching. She had gotten lucky. By smashing it on the floor and breaking it, Elvira's artificially created familiar spirit manifested. It was a rabbit, but its ferocious molars and sparkling eyes didn't belong to a herbivore. Its size was no different than that of a dhole or a jackal. Elvira quickly gathered her magic power and carved a fire-resistant spell into the rabbit's skin so that the familiar spirit could go through the fire. Since it was crudely created, she was sure that it was going to have a bad effect on the familiar spirit's body, but it didn't matter if she just used it this one time and then threw it away after. Blood sprayed out of the rabbit's skin as it screamed in pain, but Elvira forced the fire-resistant spell into it. Another strike of wind blade. Perhaps he had determined that Elvira no longer had any combat power, as this time it headed towards Ayla. Taili's elemental slash blocked the wind blade. Get it together, Ayla. The hall was filled with a wall of flame as well as the huge body of the chandelier and the dust that rose from it falling. He couldn't follow Ed's movements as he kept moving in and out of the small spaces created by the wall of fire. The wall of fire was able to be controlled to some extent by the one that had cast ignite. There was no reason for it to create any smoke or grow any bigger in size, but the heat was real. Taili was someone who was born to the way of the sword. He could cut down fire or wind if he so desired, but his growth was still lacking, so he couldn't control it over a wide range. He might have been able to break through the wall of fire, but he wasn't sure if he'd be able to defeat his opponent, who constantly kept moving locations. On top of that, in a furious rage, Ed was blatantly aiming towards Ayla. Ayla Triss might be well versed in magic knowledge, but in terms of combat power she wasn't very strong. She was at the level of a first-year student who was just starting to learn beginner magic. It was impossible for her to use the defensive magic that would enable her to block Ed's high-proficiency beginner magic. As a result, unless Taili was next to her constantly protecting her, she could be easily defeated at any moment. If Taili were to boldly close the gap to try and defeat Ed, then Ayla would be completely defenseless. Taili, it'll be better if I leave the hall. At least until you win. Ayla was clear on the fact that she was nothing more than a burden. Even though she knew she was a nuisance, she was able to come up with an immediate solution rather than being worried by it. Now that the situation has become like this, it was better for Ayla to escape to a safer place. The giant rabbit, embedded with fire resistance, rushed towards the chandelier. There was almost no burden in terms of magic power, and since it was a familiar spirit that was simply made, it was difficult to expect any great results. But at the very least, for a moment it will be able to stop Ed's movements and expose his position. Taili, if you could narrow the distance between the two of you, would you be able to defeat him? Amidst the flame, Elvira shouted. At that moment, she had lost most of her magic tools and reagents. Even so, she was still able to create a chance to defeat Ed. It's not about whether you can or can't. You have to do it. All right. Sounds like a plan. Elvira grinned. She put on her wet robe and jumped through the wall of flames. Elvira. Taili let out a cry of shock as Elvira ran across the thick walls of flames and rolled on the ground on the other side. She quickly shook off her burning robe and threw it on one side of her head. There was a flame that she quickly put out, leaving a burnt patch of hair behind. Her right forearm also looked a little burned, but she decided to not worry about it right then. Magic reagents were scattered all across the floor. She was only away from them for a short while, but she missed them all so much. Ed Rothstailer's tactical advantage came from the fact he took control of the space and obscured their view. If she were to use the reagents or magic tools, it would require her to take aim and throw them. That would take up too much time. Because of that, the only choice they had left was to take advantage of the difference in fighting power. It looks like you've prepared quite a bit, but on our side there's a warrior who can fight in close combat. She picked up a magic reagent that was quite valuable and threw it at the chandelier the middle of the hall. A heavy magical energy permeated throughout the room. A reagent made by chopping up chestnut flowers along with brown mushrooms that was given a discharging spell. The effect itself was so famous that everyone knew what would happen. The restraint of diffusing the magic power in the area. The temporary suppression of the byproducts created by using magic power. A drug that was like a magician's natural enemy. The principle of it was that, by twisting the flow of magic power irregularly, it would become difficult to use. It wouldn't work for middle-high class magicians who had a high proficiency in mana resonance, and the effect itself only lasted for a few minutes at most, so it was hard to use unless it was a short-term battle. However, her opponent was only using beginner magic. It was the perfect time to use it. Taili clearly must have understood that fact, as he quickly took an offensive stance. The wall of flames that had filled the hallway was now fading away. Across the chandelier, hidden in the dust and ash, was a man covered in blood. A hunting dagger was held in one of his hands, and in the other was the dangling corpse of a rabbit whose body was as large as his own. He was covered in the rabbit's blood as he kicked the corpse with his foot. The rabbit rolled over on the floor, quickly turning to ash and disappearing. She had bought enough time, her part was done. For the amount of effort that she put into making it, the results weren't that bad. The man's right shoulder was scarred from the rabbit's teeth, and his uniform was covered in blood. However, he was still standing there as he watched the party without any change to his expression or movements. Just looking in his eyes was terrifying. Ed Roth's tailor. Taylor ran at him, shouting as Elvira checked the labels on the reagent bottles one by one. The chestnut flower reagent that she had used would interfere with using magic power in this hall for a while. It was a fatal blow to the magicians, Ayla and Ed. However, since Ayla's power was rather weak in the first place, it was worth it. For Taylor, who used swordsmanship, and Elvira, who used magic tools and reagents, this was a brief moment where they had significantly more power. Right now, it was their turn to attack and deliver a fatal blow to Ed. However, Ed Roth's tailor didn't intend to block Taylor. Instead, he kicked down the cabinet next to him. The thick liquid from inside the basin quickly began to flow across the hall. It was the preparations that he had asked Kelly for in advance. This smell, it's oil. Taylor. Ed kicked a candlestick in the corner of the hall and knocked it over. The oil began to catch on fire. A new source of light swept over the dark hall as a new fire began to take over the space. This wasn't a magic flame that was caused by ignite. It was a real, oil-based fire. The wooden parts of the chandelier, as well as the cabinets lined up along the walls, began to catch on fire. Are you crazy? This is Ophelis Hall. Elvira shouted at him. Unlike the pillar of fire that he created using ignite, the flame that was burning now was the equivalent of a natural disaster. It would burn every single thing here equally. If the fire ended up spreading to the hallways, there could even be casualties. Thinking of that, she quickly looked around and once again, goosebumps ran over her skin. Since it all happened so quickly, she didn't have time to check properly. There were less cabinets in the hall than there usually were. Also, most of the excessively combustible pieces of furniture and valuables had been removed in advance, minimizing the number, and the smoke that was building up blocking their view was actually out by the open windows near the emergency stairs. As said before, the floor and walls of the main hall were all made out of marble, and the main entrance and door leading to the hallway were all made of antique stone. As long as this place remained closed off, there was a place for the fumes to go out, and a means to block the smell. A fire of this magnitude wouldn't even be noticed from the hallway. It was just a couple of cabinets that were burning in this magnificent hall. The fact that the fire in this hall had been prepared in advance, so that it wouldn't spread any further. What did that mean? Everything was planned, even to this point. Elvira clenched her teeth as she gathered her reagent bottles. Flames were flaring out as a bright red light filled the hall. In the center of it all, she could see the blonde, bleeding fallen aristocrat. If he had planned for this, he could have done it from the start. If he hadn't used ignite to create a fire he could control with magic in the first place, Elvira wouldn't have used the chestnut flower reagent. If there was a reason for him to progress the situation. That's right. You can't use magic anymore. Taylor yelled out again from the burning flames. The biggest variable that was restricting Taylor's movements was the presence of Ayla. As long as there was no way for him to target Ayla from a safe distance, Taylor wouldn't have any issue in closing the distance. The heat of the burning flames was intense, but for Taylor, who was born to the ways of the sword, it was easy to cut through the flames. Elvira was completely aware of the sense of confusion and discomfort that was creeping down her spine. Though their opponent was just a regular second-year magic student, he was against a warrior that used swordsmanship and a top student from the alchemy department. Just emphasizing the difference in power was hilarious. But the way he handled everything thus far was too flawless. It was as if he already knew everything about his opponents. If they were to act in a certain way, then he was already prepared for it and had another move already prepared. From neutralizing Elvira's magic tools first, then making it difficult for Taylor to close the distance, to always being out of range of Ayla's attacks, there was no flaw in his plan and there was no waste of movement in executing it. Just how much fighting power they had, to what strategy they would use, or where their psychological weak spots were, even to what was in Elvira's bag. It felt like he had known every single thing. It felt as if they were standing there, bare naked, and Elvira's sense of confusion was only making things worse. Magicians were usually people who got flustered and ended up making mistakes the moment their magic was blocked. However, his method of fighting closed the gap in specs and controlled the battlefield. He was more like a tactician than a magician. If that was the case, then the current situation was strange. Without being able to use any magic, he was just a useless piece of paper in front of Taylor, who was like a burning fire. With just one prepared stance and perfectly timed attack, Taylor could cut down the flames and break towards Ed. If he did that, he would be able to see his movement at a glance and even receive Elvira's support. If that was the case, that brief moment would be the key. But Ed Roth's Taylor was no longer able to use magic. "Don't, Taylor." Thinking that far ahead, Elvira screamed at him. However, Taylor had already started to use Elemental Slash to cut through the fire and narrow the distance to Ed. He had too much energy pushing forward, and he could no longer stop now. Progressing the situation this far meant that he still had a hidden card left over. He could somehow still attack, even without using magic. There was a physical long-range attack that Taylor and the rest of his party didn't know about. It was too late. Ed Rothstaller's hand was revealed as Taylor cut through the flames with his sword. There was a bow. He must have put it in the fallen cabinet in advance. That bow, he knew how to use it. He had already finished taking aim. Taylor would not be defeated by a single arrow. He could just swing the sword using his natural reflexes to simply deflect the arrow. Rather than limiting Taylor's movements, it could only create the opportunity for Ed to counterattack. Therefore, in order to restrict Taylor's movements, he wouldn't have been aiming at Taylor. Instead, it would be aimed at Taylor's companion, who was sitting far away in the corner of the hall. Ayla. By the time he realized, it was too late. The bowstring was released, loosing the arrow. It flew relentlessly towards its target. One of the most common things that first-year students learned was beginner defense magic. It was a magic that minimized the physical power that strikes one's body. It was also a type of magic that Ayla could use, but, coincidentally, Elvira's chestnut flower reagent was effective against all magicians, friend and foe alike. An arrow flew at Ayla, who had no method to defend. Taylor used near-superhuman reflexes to turn around and rush towards Ayla, but there was no way he could be faster than an arrow that was already flying through the air. Whoosh. Crash. But that arrow never reached Ayla. Phew. The sound of a glass marble breaking was heard. Elvira had more than 20 types of magic tools, and this was one of them, Claw Hand. It was a glass marble that had the power to attract small objects towards it, even from a distance, as long as it was within her field of vision. The arrow that was flying towards the hallway towards Ayla suddenly lost strength as it fell into Elvira's hand. Finish him, Taylor. As soon as he saw that, Taylor turned towards Ed with his eyes full of rage. Elvira didn't want to think about what was happening anymore. No matter how much he wanted to stop Taylor and his party from entering, crashing down a chandelier and setting everything on fire was just crazy. Wasn't this just supposed to be a demonstration of the lower students occupying the building? She didn't know what else was happening upstairs for him to go to this far to prevent them from going any further in Ophelis Hall, but shooting an arrow at Ayla was completely over the line. That was completely different than just simply threatening them with magic. If such an arrow had penetrated Ayla's fragile body, it may have even killed her. That act was clearly a crime. Thinking about it, Elvira tightened her grip on the arrow. And the moment she looked at the end of the arrow, her breath caught. The arrowhead had been removed. The arrowhead, which was supposed to be sharp and made of iron, was cut off. A bit of hay was even tied around it to offset the physical force as much as possible. It was a clear sign that he was trying to eliminate any sort of lethality. Did he already know that it would be too hard for them to check the state of the arrow in such a high-pressure situation? Of course, if you were unlucky then you could be blinded or injured just by the impact from the shaft. But even then, the direction in which he was aiming was between the lower abdomen and thigh, where there were very few vital points. At worst, if you were unlucky, you would just be left with a bruise. Was he going easy on us? Thinking that far, once again Elvira screamed at Taylor. Taylor, watch out. He still. The moment she was about to say, he still has something left. On the second floor, the sound of a wall being broken and a coward scream filled the air. When he came to his senses, Ed had already been struck by Taylor and was hanging against a wall. What? Sitting quietly and leaning against the wall while watching Ed, whose body was covered in blood, trying to recover, Elvira once again had a strong feeling that something was wrong. Are you insane? The chandelier was broken and most of the cabinets were burned. Ed sat against the wall of the main hall, which was a complete mess, and shook off his blood-stained clothes, but he still remained as expressionless as always. There must be a reason why you did all of this. Taylor's fist trembled as he screamed at Ed. Watching them, Elvira stayed silent. After he was defeated, the obvious result of a match between a magician and a close combat warrior, Ed eventually gave Taylor and his team access to the upper floors. Though they had a hard time, they managed to defeat him. However, Elvira didn't feel a sense of relief inside her at all. Throughout the battle, Elvira's heart, it kept on feeling like it was getting looked into, over and over again. It felt as if the entire battle played out into Ed's hands. If Ed Roths-Taylor was really trying to defeat Taylor, then he would have knocked the chandelier down without ever revealing himself. It may have been different if he was just a foolish magician that was trying to show off his skills, but the difference in Ed's appearance during the fight was indescribable. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had some sort of hidden agenda. Taylor and Ayla seemed unable to think that far ahead due to the urgency of the situation, but Elvira was completely stiff, contrary to her usual childish appearance. As expected, something is strange. Elvira looked at his face from behind Taylor, who was screaming in anger. Despite his loss, he didn't feel any sort of resentment. He was truly just sitting against the wall, waiting for Taylor to stop screaming. After a while, Taylor took a deep breath as he managed his emotions. Then Ed spoke, raising his head. Are you done? Even though the situation has come this far, he never once lost that calm tone to his voice. If you're done, go on up already. Stop whining. He wasn't even telling them not to go up. What did you say? Elvira pushed Taylor out of the way as she stood right before Ed, looking down on him. Coming this far, she couldn't help but ask him. Why did you go easy on us? Ed's expression didn't change a bit at that question. Rather, it was Taylor and Ayla who were surprised by it. What do you mean, Elvira? This person went easy on us. Elvira continued glaring straight at Ed, ignoring Taylor and Ayla's questions. Answer me. Again, there was a moment of silence. But Elvira was unwilling to break it. She continued to stare at him as she leaned against the wall, refusing to move until Ed responded. But of course, she couldn't keep on questioning him forever. The main entrance of Ophelis Hall opened up again. The soft sound of the rain falling against the outer wall was briefly buried by the sound of the heavy rain coming through the main entrance. Lighting struck. In that brief moment, everything was illuminated. A girl stood there, struggling to shake off the water that fell on her hood. The girl who had stayed up all night picking her persimmon hairpin was revealed from the darkness. Who could scold such a foolish, love-struck girl? It may have all been in her head, but even imagining such things was all her own choice. However, the difference between one's imagination and reality is sometimes cruel. The boy who she had thought would show up to the pavilion looking handsome had been attacked by a group of people and collapsed on the floor, covered in his own blood. Against the backdrop of the pouring rain, the girl's expression in the darkness suddenly went cold. Her usually bright and lively eyes were now empty, full of darkness. What are you doing? With a heavy voice, she questioned them. Chapter 35. The Occupation of Ophelis Hall 5. Something that I need to take care of suddenly came up, so I might be a little late. I'll be there as fast as I can, so please just wait a little longer. I'm sorry. It would be a lie to say that something didn't feel right. From the tone of his voice and the note he left her, it was clear to her that Ed Roth's tailor had gotten caught up in some unexpected trouble. Nevertheless, Yennecar put away her worries about Ed Roth's tailor. He was someone that was always able to deal with any crisis or problem in a smooth manner. He never took any unnecessary actions and would always finish the job quickly. Whether it was simply chopping firewood or making tools for survival, to intervening in the student center's subjugation team that was in a tough spot because of Yennecar's mistake. Ed Roth's tailor was someone who had created a certain expectation around himself that he could somehow solve any problem, no matter how big or small. Only after being stabbed in one's blind spot, hidden in their complacency, is one able to truly reflect on themselves. "I'll definitely help you then." She remembered when she told Ed those words, sitting in his camp and looking up at the stars. She meant for him to ask her for help whenever something difficult arose, or if there was something too burdensome for him to take on alone. Yennecar Polarover was fully aware of her own strength. She didn't often reveal it because of her humble and sympathetic nature, but she had complete confidence that she would surely be of help to him in the event of a crisis. But Ed Roth's tailor never asked her for help. He fought until the point where he was covered in blood, but ultimately ended up collapsing with a beaten body. He had ignored Yennecar, who had told him that she would always lend him a hand whenever he needed it, and fought by himself to the very end. What was the reason for that? What was the reason he left her a letter that was so unusual, why he made sure that she was outside of Ophelis Hall, and why he had to fight here, to the point that he was bleeding? She didn't know what was happening in Ophelis Hall, but she wondered if he was just trying to make sure that she wasn't involved. Yennecar Polarover's strength wasn't at the level that Ed would need to worry about it. However, Yennecar had already been given various disciplinary actions due to the Glasgow incident. Creating any more trouble here would only ruin all of the hard work that her peers put in to support her and to make sure that she would only receive a light punishment. Seeing Ed Roth's tailor fighting all the way to the end, until he was completely covered in blood, if Yennecar saw such a thing, would she be able to hold herself back? She immediately shook her head. That was why Ed Roth's tailor had made sure to push Yennecar away from the battlefield. Considering that, an unbearable anger surged from inside Yennecar's chest. She didn't know why Ed Roth's tailor was fighting until things became like this. However, at the very least she knew quite well that he was not the type of person who would commit irrational actions or evil deeds like the rumors claimed that he would. What was she doing while Ed Roth's tailor was fighting here, to this extent? While someone was walking out towards a battlefield by himself, what was Yennecar thinking? She worried about her clothes, making her hair nice, and the color of her hairpin, all while she stayed up late at night in excitement, as her imagination went wild like any other girl who had fallen in love. The direction of her anger was towards herself. But right now, it was the time to put that anger aside. Schwa, with her back to the sound of the falling rain and her head lowered, she quietly asked Taylor and the rest of the party a single question. "What are you doing?" There was a chill in her voice. "Yennecar." Taylor was the first to respond. It went without saying, but at this point there was no way for Taylor to understand Yennecar's feelings. "Thankfully you didn't get caught up in this situation, Yennecar. Right now, Ophelis Hall is being occupied by other students. But I don't think it will simply end like this. Seeing as Ed went this far to stop us, that must mean there's something else." "Is that so?" With her head down, it was hard to see Yennecar's eyes. However, the fact that she was glaring directly at them was obvious. At that moment, a huge amount of magic power fluctuated around the main entrance of Ophelis Hall. The mana resonance level of the second-year magic department's top student was impressive enough to even make alumni stare in awe. Her collar stood up as the wind hit her skin. The small chandeliers on the ceiling began to shake like crazy as they threatened to crash down next to the main chandelier. What? Yennecar, what are you doing?" She didn't summon the high-ranking fire spirit token. Because of its enormous power, it hadn't fully recovered from the damage caused by its previous battle. Though, she didn't need to borrow the power of a high-ranking spirit against 3 first-year students. Mid-ranking fire spirit Olgoas, mid-ranking wind spirit Pesci, mid-ranking water spirit Flan, mid-ranking earth spirit Tyke. The 4 mid-ranking spirits were summoned together to deal with Taylor's party. Besides those four, many other fluid spirits and lower spirits also began to rise, creating what looked like an army. On the first floor, the windows began to shatter as the wind swept around. The rain mixed with the pieces of glass that was caught up in a storm of mana that shook the entire main hall. Get a grip, Taylor. She's an enemy. Elvira, who was the first one to realize the situation, quickly picked up all of the reagent bottles. She put them, one by one, into the hole of her torn alchemy bag. The rain was flying around like crazy and obscuring their vision. You know, what you guys were doing, I wasn't even curious about at all. What Yennecar wanted wasn't that complicated. Did you guys do that to Ed? To that extent, she didn't ask that question in such a straightforward manner. What was happening at Ophelis Hall, and what Taylor and the rest of his party were thinking of by trying to enter Ophelis Hall, was no longer Yennecar's concern. Yennecar. Through the wind and rain, she heard that boy's voice. He couldn't hold himself up properly, but from the bottom of his throat he was able to squeeze out Yennecar's name. Seeing the boy's wrecked body, Yennecar's heart was struck with pain. She didn't want him to use his strength unnecessarily, so she quietly responded to Ed. Just wait 1 minute, Ed. At most, it would be just a minute. That was more than enough time to sort this situation out. It was obvious that the aftermath would lead to the destruction of Ophelis Hall, hurt her juniors, and would break school rules. Nevertheless, the thing that was pushing Yennecar to go to such extremes was her past self. She wanted to live up to expectations, she never wanted to harm others, and would always try her hardest for the people close to her. That was most definitely who she saw in the mirror. On the other side, reflected in the mirror was Ed. Ed, who was trying to take on all the work by himself for Yennecar's sake, to the point that he collapsed, covered in blood. His appearance was what had triggered Yennecar Polarover's wrath. Yennecar knew herself just how sad and grief-stricken she was, which is why she couldn't leave Ed Roth's Taylor like that. An eagle made of fire, a raging lion formed by the wind, a giant shaped by water, and a horse created with mud all stood for their summoner. Each and every one of them was a mid-ranking spirit that could only be defeated with 4 to 5 people rushing it. Taylor and his party began to break into a cold sweat as they took their stances. We have to run away, Taylor. Elvira understood the situation. She didn't know why Yennecar was so angry, but knew that it would only be suicide to attack that ridiculously powerful magician. Even Lortel, who was one of the members of Class A who was also known to be one of the best in terms of delicately managing magic power, she couldn't even let out a sound in front of that monster. Let's just accept the obvious. There's no way that we can pass through here. An unexpected presence. Ed Roth's Taylor, the fallen aristocrat that was guarding the first floor of Ophelis Hall. It took a long time to defeat him, even with their overwhelming difference in power, but now even the second-year top student had shown up, summoning mid-ranking spirits. It would be ridiculous to get themselves any further involved in this situation just because of a few expensive herbs. That's right, but... However, Taylor couldn't get rid of that uncomfortable feeling. It seemed that whatever was happening now in Ophelis Hall wasn't just a simple occupation. He was sure that there was some greater darkness hiding behind it. He sensed the presence of a black curtain. In Taylor's position, this might have been someone else's matter to deal with. It was a completely different story if it meant that there were actually going to be students that would be harmed. Taylor's sense of justice was innate, and his dominant attitude in the face of hardship was a quality that would drag him to his grave. It was obvious that Taylor was going to live the life of a protagonist. The huge wall that stood in his way, Yennecar Polarover, was one he had experienced before. Could he simply overcome the overwhelming difference in power with just tenacity? However, that uncertainty wasn't important to Taylor. Taylor was a person who would always act in accordance with what he believed was right. He even survived seemingly impossible hardships and evils doing so. However, Taylor's recklessness could only be seen as correct, because the world had recognized him as the protagonist. However he managed to overcome hardships, Taylor would end up growing because of it, so as long as the storyline of Sylvania's failed swordmaster kept moving forward without breaking, the cycle would continue to repeat as he grew. However, the Yennecar that he once again met was an enemy that was outside of that storyline. Would Taylor's disposition as the protagonist end up being ruined because of this enemy, who showed up outside of the original flow of the story? Could he even overcome this trial, full of overwhelming strength, that was standing before him with just his disposition alone? As everyone knows, hardships in real life are never as easy to overcome as in a game's dramatic storyline. If there was a severe power difference, then defeat was only natural. A sudden awakening of power, the interference of an opportunity granted by fate, a development that allowed one to accidentally overcome a trial, those were all just moments added to a game scenario. Taylor, get a grip. Face reality already. Since all the windows are broken, let's get out that way. Go while you can. It was Ed Roth's Taylor who stood up and interrupted Elvira. Yennecar, it's fine. I'm all right, so calm down. Yennecar was boiling with rage to the very top of her head, looking like a disaster waiting to happen. The hem of her robe was fluttering in her light pink hair was completely wet, making her look like a ghost that had climbed out of a swamp. My plan was to just send Taylor upstairs as I went to sit down under the Rose Gardens pavilion with Yennecar. I planned to talk with her and watch the occupation at Ophelis Hall come to an end. I even left a note for her, promising that I would be there soon, just in case she was going to go somewhere else. I thought that if I made such a promise and apologized, then Yennecar, who was born naive and kind, wouldn't leave her spot. I don't know what happened for her to come back to Ophelis Hall. In any case, Yennecar's kindness ended up backfiring. I thought that we had gotten pretty close after talking about all sorts of things as we spent time together back at the camp, but she was also a great person, one who would never sit back after her friend had been beaten up to a pulp like this. If I didn't do something about this, Taylor and his party would end up getting beaten up. Listen, I'll take care of Yennecar, so you guys go upstairs to the second floor as you planned. What? Aelatrice looked at me with a face full of shock. Just a bit ago you were trying so hard to block our path, but now you want us to just go to the second floor. In the first place, I had just used a few tricks to test out Taylor's specs. If he didn't have high enough specs to clear Act 2, then there would have been an issue. That was the only reason I did it. I changed my mind, so hurry and go up. Ha ha ha. Really? You're going to stop those spirits? Your body is completely covered in injuries right now. I walked over to Elvira, who was laughing her heart out at the situation, and thumped her on the head. Elvira took a step back, clasping her head as she let out a pained sound. Take your reagents. I'm sorry that I tore up your bag. The various effects from the reagents that Elvira had was going to be useful in the battle against the twin maids on the third floor. Elvira was the most troublesome opponent of members in this Ophelis Hall subjugation team, so I had to make sure to seal her reagents first so she couldn't fight. I didn't think there would be anyone this annoying to deal with later on. In the first place, the occupation of Ophelis Hall wasn't that difficult of an event. It looked like they had enough power, so it was fine to relax and loosen up for the remainder of it. What? This, and then that, just what? Elvira looked at me, completely dumbfounded. However, I couldn't keep worrying about her. I made my way to the center of the hall, through the rain and wind that was full of broken glass from the windows. I could only see Yennecar's eyes through the swarming spirits. Her cold eyes were completely different from usual. Anyway, the reason why Yennecar was so angry was because of her natural personality. That was something that having good personal connections also meant. Thankfully, I was already friendly enough with Yennecar to be considered close to her. Knowing lots of people was the best advantage that you could have in your life. Relationships that came from family, school, or even fate. The trinity of personal connections. I was always grateful for them, as they could overcome the frustrations of life. No matter how rich, capable, or respected your family might be, you should always remain humble and nice to the people around you. You could never know how they would come back to repay you. Now was the time for me to benefit from that personal connection with her. I walked straight towards Yennecar. All sorts of spirits filled the hall, but they didn't care about the ones that their master wasn't hostile towards. I walked straight in front of Yennecar, pushing through the gap. Ed, don't push yourself too hard. Just stay to the side, I'll finish up the rest. Yennecar, you can explain the details to me later. First, I'll quickly finish this up and we can get you treated. I put my hand on Yenikar's shoulder and clearly said, "I'm really okay, so you don't have to go overboard." The sudden skinship could be considered a symbol of rudeness. I knew just how burdensome it was for someone to put their hand on your shoulder without saying anything, staring straight at you. However, when dealing with someone whose emotions were out of control and their ears closed, it was necessary to make such a gesture to have them hear you out. Only then did Yenikar start to go back to her regular self, little by little. Ed, your hand is on my shoulder. Yenikar, first, get rid of the spirits. The wind is too strong, so I'm having a hard time standing. Yeah, of course. It must be hard for you to stand up. I'm sorry. What did I do? I'm such an idiot. After that, it all happened in an instant. The raging storm of magic power quickly died down, and all the spirits waiting for their master's order to attack disappeared. After a while, the main hall of Ophelis Hall was once again filled with the sound of the falling rain. Quote. Taylor and his party were staring, completely stunned, as I quickly waved my hand at them. They all looked as if they had seen a ghost. At this rate, they might end up missing Clevius, who was wandering around on the second floor. If that happened, it would be troublesome to deal with. Hurry and go, I don't think there's much time left. Saying that, I finally lost all of my strength. The completely confused Yenikar was frantically holding my collapsed body up. Schwa, I'm really upset. The pouring rain only added to the atmosphere. Sitting and holding her knees, Yenikar's voice was low and didn't sound very good. The main hall on the first floor Ophelis Hall was a complete mess. Taylor and his party went up the stairs to the second floor while Yenikar and I sat alone, leaning against the wall and listening to the rain. We looked quite funny as we were both completely drenched, but, sometimes, after getting rained on, for some reason you could feel a sense of freedom and exaltation. Anyway, I thought that Taylor's specs were growing quite well. There didn't seem to be any issues. Looking at the range of his elemental slash, as well as the speed and precision in which he struck, I could figure it out. It seemed that all of the regular events had been completed well. Of course, from my point of view he wasn't completely perfect. But that was only because I was to the furthest extent. I should have just been happy that he had attained the specs to be able to clear it. In any case, for a short while it would just be a matter of mental strength. As the story progressed, it would push a human's sanity to its furthest. Professor Glass's celestial magic would trap Taylor in the cracks of time, causing him to experience hundreds and thousands of deaths. Lucis' supreme rank magic would put Taylor on the brink of death, and Mebula, who was the evil god summoned by the head of House Crepin, would trap him in his worst nightmare. Despite that, even in the ordeals that would test one's mind to its limits, Taylor would never give in. I had said it quite a few times already, but I didn't want to take on such hardships. I was planning to just take care of myself and rake in the success, but, when I came to my senses, things had become like this. As expected, not everything in the world goes as planned. Why do you never say anything and get hurt? I told you to come talk to me if there was something going on. There was a reason for it this time. Next time, I'll tell you everything. I persuaded Yenikar, who was twisting my arm, to go see a therapist immediately, as we sat on the first floor of the main hall and waited for the event to come to an end. Though it was originally supposed to be in the Rose Garden, now we were waiting in the main hall of Ophelis Hall to check if there were any possible variables, and if everything was going as planned. For quite some time, I sat next to Yenikar as we watched the rain pour down outside the half-destroyed main hall. Although there were some variables, somehow we passed the first floor event safely and Taylor's specs were growing without any issues. The job itself went as I had planned. They really went too far. I don't know exactly what happened, but there shouldn't ever be a reason to attack someone to this extent. Next time we meet, I'm going to get really angry at them. It was completely understandable that Yenikar would say such a thing, as she didn't know about the chandelier I made fall, or the fire that I set, or the arrow that I shot. I was grateful that she was unconditionally on my side, but I didn't feel comfortable explaining everything that happened to her. Well, it would be fine to put it aside and do it later. Anyway, Ed, don't go around getting hurt, okay? You got it. Promise me. All right. Thanks for worrying about me. Considering that, I calmed down and let myself rest. It was a little different from what I had planned, but in the end I had done my part as the first floor boss. Now, I could take a break and take care of the work at my camp. I felt a sense of relief, listening to the sound of the rain. My heart felt a little more at ease. That was, until I heard what Yennecar had to say. By the way, Ed. When I was sitting in the rose garden, I saw a very big carriage. It went by so quickly that I couldn't see it well, but there was a golden crown on it. Thinking about it carefully, isn't that a carriage from the Elt store? I read about it in a book long ago. That golden crown, for sure, the head of the Elt store, that's the pattern for the Golden King, Elt, right? The fake boss, the Golden King, Elt, who would leave the stage after being stabbed in the back by Lortel in the event that took place after the occupation of Ophelis Hall, the battle for the Sage's Seal. The fact that he had arrived in Sylvania way before it was planned. It was completely outside my range of knowledge, that meant that something unexpected must have happened. Once again, I started to get anxious. You're not hurt anywhere else, are you, Taily? Yay, I'm okay. Ayla also seems fine. What about you, Elvira? Do you have enough reagents? I have enough, so don't worry. Ophelis Hall that was still getting rained on. The 3 members of the subjugation team climbed the stairs as they checked on each other's strength and healed any wounds they had. They had felt that something was happening in Ophelis Hall, but they needed to make sure of that fact. At least from the first floor, the fact that Ed Roth's tailor went to such extremes to stop them was unusual. It was too tiring to face off against Ed Roth's tailor, since it was impossible to figure out what he was thinking or feeling. Even Yennecar Polarover was about to enter the fight as their enemy. They couldn't figure out what was happening yet, but they wouldn't let down their guard any further. From the next floor, the enemies who would be blocking Taily and his party would be just as difficult and complicated as on the first floor, or maybe they could be even more troublesome. Just thinking about it gave them goosebumps. Nevertheless, they had no intention of going back down. Calming themselves, the group continued to climb. Up the stairs. They couldn't ever let their guard down.